So I know I'm a little bit late on this, but a few weeks ago I went and saw a film that I've been looking forward to for a pretty long time, The Brutalist. And aside from the beautiful look of the film and it at least being partly about brutalist architecture, which I do have a lot of thoughts about, I learned that the film was shot on VistaVision, a format that hasn't been used in Hollywood film for over half a century. I mean, we're talking over 6 decades. And that, combined with my last video that I made about the history of aspect ratios, all but forced me to make a video deep diving into the potential all-star back on the main stage. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's set the scene a little bit for the origins of VistaVision and the events that followed. The widescreen revolution and the following widescreen battles of the 1950s changed the landscape of cinema forever. While 20th Century Fox had CinemaScope and Warner Brothers had their not so successful Warner Superscope, Paramount Pictures developed its own influential widescreen format, VistaVision. But what exactly is VistaVision and why did it seemingly disappear from Hollywood films? Well, in the early 1950s, film studios were in a constant battle to bring bigger, better, and honestly sometimes just plain different images to audiences. These widescreen ratios like Cinerama and Todd AO were used as studios battled each other for a bigger slice of that Hollywood pie. Pie. And to combat television, helping differentiate the spectacle and experience of going to the cinema from just watching TV at home. And the technology used for these aspect ratios was highly sought after. Fox actually beat Warner Brothers to the punch by just a few hours in securing the rights to Henri Criten's anamorphoscope, which would then eventually become CinemaScope. And then other studios had to scramble to develop their own widescreen formats if they wanted to compete. John Bishop, the head of Paramount's camera department at the time, created the first VistaVision format camera by flipping a natural color camera on its side and modifying it to use a set of Leica stills lenses. This became the first of 2 Lazy 8 cameras that were used to film the very first VistaVision film, White Christmas.
But I recommend a little shut-eye, go to sleep.
And it was a huge success, becoming the top-grossing film of 1954 and becoming the top-grossing musical of all time.
I feel so alive!
Part of this success is due to the look and feel that VistaVision had. Unlike other traditional 35mm formats of the time, which had the film running vertically through the gate, VistaVision flipped the film on its side, running it through horizontally. This meant that instead of having the usual 4 perfs per frame, VistaVision used 8, creating a negative that was about 2.66 times bigger than that of standard 35mm film. An easy way to think about this is with film photography. Each frame runs through the photo camera from left to right, rather than top down. VistaVision is the same thing, just at a much higher speed than a photo camera can handle. This larger negative size gave the films much more detail and a much finer grain. Plus, the native 1.5:1 ratio could be cropped to 1.66 or a 1.85 ratio, giving the format a lot of room to adjust the final look in post. And then after the success of White Christmas, Paramount placed an order with the Mitchell Camera Company for even more dedicated VistaVision cameras. And they would then use those on Cecil DeMille's The Ten Commandments. But those wouldn't be ready for another 2 years. So, while they were getting made, Technicolor converted old 3-strip color cameras to the VistaVision format. Later on in 1957, these would be used with anamorphic attachments to create Technorama films, giving that extra widescreen anamorphic look to the higher quality VistaVision footage. Once the cameras were ready though, Paramount had another smash hit with The Ten Commandments.
Behold his mighty hand!
It was the highest grossing film of 1956 and the second most successful of that entire decade. By April of '57, the film had already earned $10 million from just 80 theaters. It was averaging around $1 million per week. Those 2 films weren't the only success stories either. In fact, one of the most well-known directors of all time, Alfred Hitchcock, used the format for multiple hit films like To Catch a Thief, Vertigo, and North by Northwest. But there was still something that seemed a little odd to me about VistaVision. If it was shot in a large 8x format, why wasn't it shown in theaters that way? Why did Paramount print the films on the standard 35mm format? One of the key parts of this answer actually goes back to a time before VistaVision even existed. In 1948, there was a Supreme Court case called the United States versus Paramount Pictures Incorporated. It was also known as the Hollywood antitrust case of 1948. This case, as the name might suggest, is about antitrust laws regarding Hollywood movie studios that owned their own theaters and held exclusive rights on what movies could be shown at these theaters. Along with the theaters, studios had writers, directors, producers, actors, staff, all under contracts. They owned the film processing and film labs, and they created and distributed their own prints, and basically created a vertically integrated oligopoly. This 1948 Supreme Court ruling stated that film studios could no longer own theaters and put a dent in that oligopoly that they had. This ruling was then later dissolved in 2019 because the courts determined that it was basically impossible for studios to hold that same amount of power given the media landscape that we have today. With streaming, the internet, not as easy. But to bring this back to VistaVision, basically that Supreme Court ruling stopped Paramount Pictures from putting the equipment that they needed to play these 8x films in a bunch of their own theaters because they no longer owned any theaters. And so theaters had what was played most often, 35mm prints. And as technology advancements were made in the chemical processing of film, in the actual emulsions that were used on the negatives, the benefits of using VistaVision became slimmer and slimmer. And in the early 60s, the last movies using VistaVision as their primary production system were made. The first was Marlon Brando's 1961 film, One-Eyed Jacks, and the second was the 1963 film, My Six Loves, directed by Gower Champion. As the move away from VistaVision was happening, Paramount adopted the Technorama format for a short amount of time. This used the converted Technicolor cameras and paired them with anamorphic lenses to create a true widescreen aspect ratio of 2.35:1. Now, the shift only lasted a brief amount of time, and eventually, many of the VistaVision cameras found their way into foreign film productions like Nagisa Oshima's Death by Hanging, Empire of Passion, and even some animated films like Lupin III, The Mystery of Mamo, using a VistaVision format dubbed Anime Vision. However, VistaVision's exit from Hollywood didn't last very long, because it saw a resurgence in the 70s as a VFX format. While it wasn't used for principal photography anymore, the larger negatives and higher quality images made compositing and VFX work easier to do. This was brought into the spotlight when it was used on the original Star Wars trilogy, but was further used by films like Jurassic Park, The Matrix, and even 2023's Poor Things. So it's not as though the format wasn't used after the 50s and early 60s, it just wasn't in the spotlight as the primary production system anymore, and so it fell into obscurity for most moviegoers. But then, after 61 years, VistaVision was once again used as the primary system on the production of Brady Corbet's The Brutalist.
There was a war on, and yet many of the sites of my projects had survived. My buildings were devised to endure such erosion of shoreline.
Now, the choice to use VistaVision on this film was not just some obscure pull a different format out of a hat type of deal. Corbet and D.P. Lowell Crawley knew that they were going to shoot on film, and they'd shot all their previous work together on film. But filming these large, imposing architectural structures on 35mm film is hard to do without using a super wide-angle lens that inevitably is going to introduce some distortion, and they wanted to combat that. So they opted for VistaVision. And you can kind of think of this like a full-frame sensor versus a crop sensor. You're always going to need a wider lens on a crop sensor camera to get that same field of view on a full-frame sensor. The same goes for VistaVision versus traditional 35mm film. And the finished product is stunning. The Brutalist is a visually gorgeous film that really shows off what the VistaVision process can do when it's used with modern day technology. And while the film is really important to the continuing history of VistaVision, this isn't going to be a review of the actual film itself. I think there are lots of great videos out there already that do that. But I do think there are a few questions that are important to ask when it comes to this film and the history of VistaVision. The first being, why is it being shown in 70mm? VistaVision uses 35mm film, so why would they print onto actual 70mm? Well, there's actually a history of doing this with a format called Super VistaVision. Back in the late 1980s, the format was named after Paramount had the VistaVision negative of the 10 Commandments printed to 70mm film. But the results weren't very good, and it wasn't until they tried the same thing with Hitchcock's Vertigo that they were able to get the framing to stay correct within that 1.85:1 ratio. Another reason they did this goes back to what we talked about earlier. Theaters just aren't able to show an 8-perf print of the film. So showing in 70mm is, as Corbet says,
a 35mm print, even though it's beautiful, is down-resing the quality of the image. So 70mm is the only way to see everything that's there.
All other formats would either be a digitized version or downscaled to fit a smaller film projection. So it makes sense that there would be some 70mm showings of the film. But why show it in IMAX? I mean, that's a totally different format with a unique aspect ratio. And to be honest, the best I could find for that is just that IMAX is good for marketing. It's the premier film format and people will pay a premium to see movies that way. And the 1.5:1 native aspect ratio of VistaVision also helps reduce the amount of crop for an IMAX cut. Now, personally, I think that choosing VistaVision is such a unique film format that, showing in IMAX feels a little bit like a missed opportunity, but they already have the infrastructure there for showing large format films. So in that way, I kind of get it. That wraps up my video on the surge, death, and potential resurgence that we're seeing of VistaVision. Let me know if you think that VistaVision will make a comeback as the new Hollywood favorite down in the comments below. And I hope that you learned something new about this unique and influential VistaVision aspect ratio. And as always, thanks for watching.